Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew, and I'm here from Code Day to talk about open source software and kind of give a brief overview of how it works and how you can contribute to it. The more in-depth view of the topics we're going to cover is, first of all, the importance of open source, the various tools used for open source development, and a hands-on example of how to contribute to a project using an example. So the first thing we need to talk about is what open source software actually is. And it has a pretty basic definition, but it can definitely get very complex once you get into the history of it and what differentiates it from other types of open source software, such as free software. So first of all, software, it has to be licensed to be collaboratively developed. So there's many different licenses that you can attach to software. And what a license does is it tells other people how they can interact with it and how they can use it. So there's two different types. There's closed source, maybe owned by a company. For example, Windows would be a closed source software because you can't see how it actually works and you have to pay to use it. Additionally, users need to be able to use, edit, and distribute the software freely. So that means you can use it however you want, you can edit it and still use it however you want, and then give it to other people however you want. And then anyone can improve open source software. So this is one of the most important facts about open source software is that anyone that has the ability and the will to do so can go in, edit the code themselves, and make improvements to it. Big examples of open source software is WordPress.org. That's a type of web hosting software that powers some massive amount of websites. I think it's around 50% of websites run some form of WordPress. There's also Android, which is the mobile OS that's used all around the world, and then also Linux. So one of the differentiations I want to make is the difference between free software and open source software. There's two very different trains of thoughts within the free software and open software community. You can almost think of them as the political parties of software development. So the thing about free software is that not only does it need to have all the aspects of open source software, such as the freedoms to edit, run, distribute, and study the code, it also has to be dealt with, revolve around free principles. So an example of this is that this program has to respect the user's freedom, let them do whatever they want. For example, a DRM, an open source DRM, wouldn't be an example of free software because it doesn't protect the user's right to edit the software and be able to run it and share it between other people. It's very important to know that with open source software and free software, that it has nothing to do with the price. So you can still charge for the software. Typically, that'll be done in like support. Maybe you'll be supported with someone, and it's definitely okay to charge that. And other projects will ask for donations. Now, open source software still needs to allow people to edit and distribute the software, but it doesn't have any ethics or principles around it. So the software can be as restrictive as you want, but it can still be open source. One bigger example of this is Visual Studio Code. A lot of people in the free software community don't believe this is free software because even though it's open source, it's very restrictive as to how you can use it. So the reason why we want it to be open source and what it's good for companies that use the software and then also individuals is that it allows for flexibility. So what this means is that if the software that you're using doesn't do exactly what it wanted to do, developers can actually go into it and edit it. This also allows for longevity, which means that the code can be used for longer, even if it gets used for 5 years and then it's no longer applicable. It's great that developers can go in and because of the flexibility offered, edit it to keep it relevant. Code also isn't locked into a vendor, for example, Microsoft. So for example, if the Microsoft was to, explode tomorrow and the whole company went downhill, you still wouldn't be restricted in how you use the software if it was open source. It's also very cheap, of course, although there's not an explicit price attached to it. Typically, there's very cheap suggested donation or maintenance costs associated with it. So it's very easy to develop. And then there's also a lot of companies that will sponsor open source development because they understand how important it is to them. And they might have to give, maybe support it a little bit, but then there's no obligation. And then also one of my favorite things about open source software and why I think it's so important is how it deals with progress. So open source software definitely moves software development forward because it allows new developers and other developers to see how big applications work and it has people collaborate on them. So to contribute to open source software, it's typically pretty simple. So the first thing you're going to need is strong programming skills. So although you definitely don't need to be a professional programmer, you don't need to be a master, especially when it comes to some of the changes you're going to be making to software. Maybe you're just fixing a typo in the documentation. You don't need to have the strongest programming skills, but you definitely need to have an understanding of how the language you're going to be working with works. The next thing you're going to need is an integrated development environment, or an IDE, or a text editor. This is how you're actually going to change the code, work with it, and make sure it works. Your changes work before you make a pull request. The next thing you're going to need is Git and a GitHub account. Those two are kind of synonymous, but it's very important that you set up Git properly and you're able to access it from a terminal. And then you have a GitHub account to be able to fork and clone the open source project.